Hello, young soul. Welcome to the Daily Horror Channel. If you are afraid of real and scary reports, this channel is not for you. I suggest you leave this video, but if you are not afraid of listening to these horrifying reports, I suggest you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. At the convent of Santa Clara in a forgotten town called Villa Santana, the nuns lived a life of prayer and contemplation. Founded in the 17th century, the convent was a place of spiritual refuge, but it also held dark secrets that not even the oldest sisters dared to uncover. One of those secrets was the Forbidden Room, a locked and forgotten room located deep within the convent that the nuns were instructed to avoid at all costs. I am Sister Helena, a young nun who has recently arrived at Santa Clara. Since I was a child, I have been raised with an unshakable faith and a burning desire to serve God. When I entered the convent, I expected to find peace and purpose, but instead I was greeted by a dark and mysterious atmosphere. The convent, with its stone walls and narrow windows, seemed to whisper stories from a distant past. The nuns, though kind, kept to themselves, and a veil of silence hung over the community. My curiosity about the Forbidden Room began one winter night when the wind blew hard, making the trees around the convent sway like haunted giants. I was in the library, organizing some old books, when I found a dusty diary hidden among the shelves. The diary belonged to Sister Beatrice, a nun who had lived in the convent for over 100 years. Her entries spoke of a locked room, full of macabre secrets and of unexplained events that haunted the convent. I decided to ask the Mother Superior about the room. "Mother, what is this forbidden room that Sister Beatrice spoke of in her diary?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The Mother Superior's face went pale, and her eyes narrowed in concern. "Sister Helena, it is best not to involve yourself in such matters. The room is locked for a reason. Focus on your prayers and duties," she replied, her voice firm but filled with restrained fear. Despite the warning, my curiosity only grew. I knew I had to find out what was hidden in that room. Over the next few weeks, I began to notice strange things happening around me. Objects would move by themselves, unexplained noises would echo through the hallways at night, and shadows would dance at the edge of my vision. The other nuns seemed disturbed too, but they avoided talking about it. One night, as I was walking through the convent, I heard a soft, melancholy violin melody coming from one of the abandoned rooms. I followed the sound, which seemed to be calling me, to a locked door. I recognized the door from the descriptions in Sister Beatrice's diary. It was the Forbidden Room. My instincts told me to run away, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided I had to go in and find out the truth. Over the next few days, I searched for a key that would open the room. Finally, I found a rusty key hidden in an old box in the attic. That night, I waited until all the nuns were asleep and went to the Forbidden Room. My hand shook as I inserted the key into the lock. The door creaked open with an ominous creak, revealing a dark, dusty room. Inside, I found a collection of disturbing objects, torture devices, black candles, and ancient ritual books. In the center of the room sat an ancient violin, covered in dust. As I played the violin, I felt a wave of cold pass through my body. Suddenly, I heard a whisper next to me, "Help us." I turned quickly, but no one was there. Over the next few days, the paranormal activity intensified. The nuns began to fall mysteriously ill, and I myself began to have terrifying visions of nuns being tortured and killed. I knew I had to find out the story behind the violin and the spirit that haunted it. I spent hours in the library, reading every book I could find about the past of the convent and its former inhabitants. I discovered that during the Inquisition, the convent had been used as a place of interrogation and torture. Nuns accused of heresy were brutally tortured and killed, and their spirits never found peace. The violin belonged to Lorenzo Bellini, a musician who had been brought to the convent to entertain the nuns but who became involved in macabre rituals. He was accused of heresy and executed, and his spirit was trapped in the violin. I decided that I needed to perform a ritual to appease the spirits and free the convent from the curse. I gathered the necessary items and waited until midnight, when paranormal activity was at its peak. I lit the black candles around the violin and began to play the melody described in the ritual books. The room filled with an oppressive energy, and the shadows began to stir. As I played, I saw the spectral figures of tortured nuns materialize around me. Their faces were contorted in pain, and their empty eyes stared at me with despair. "Help us," they whispered in unison. I continued playing, trying to ignore the fear that consumed me. I felt the presence of Lorenzo Bellini approaching, his shadowy figure standing out among the others. Suddenly, the violin was snatched from my hands by an invisible force. Lorenzo Bellini appeared before me, his face disfigured by hatred. "Do you think you can destroy me?" he whispered, his voice echoing through the room. "You freed part of me, but now you are trapped too." The room began to shake, and I felt a powerful force pulling me towards the violin. I fought with all my might, but I was sucked into the instrument, into a world of darkness and despair. I screamed for help, but my words were swallowed by the darkness. Bellini laughed, his figure becoming increasingly indistinct. "Welcome to my kingdom," he said. "Here, the terror never ends." Inside the violin, the world was a constant nightmare. Shadows danced around me, whispering promises of eternal pain. Every step I took, the ground moved as if it were alive. Spectral figures appeared from the shadows, their faces distorted with grief. Time has lost its meaning. I didn't know if days or hours had passed. The feeling of despair was overwhelming, each attempt to escape resulting in more pain. Finally, I accepted my fate. I was trapped in an eternal nightmare, a prisoner of the shadows. The terror had no end, and the only certainty I had left was that I would never find peace. Villa Santana, the convent of Santa Clara, my sisters of faith. Everything seemed like a distant dream, swallowed by darkness. The horror of knowing that my sacrifice was in vain, that the curse continues, is a weight that will never stop tormenting me. And so, with my last shred of sanity, I make one last plea. If you ever find the damned violin, destroy it completely. Because the evil he holds must not be released, and the terror he carries must not be experienced by anyone. But my story doesn't end here. A new chapter of horror is about to begin. The darkness that swallowed my soul still lurks, waiting to claim its next victim. If anyone dares to defy fate and free the spirits trapped in the violin, the cycle of horror will begin again. And this time, the evil will be even more ruthless. Inside the violin, time has lost all meaning. The shadows around me whispered incessantly, promising unimaginable pain. Each attempt to escape resulted in torment, and I felt sanity slowly slipping through the cracks in my mind. The spectral figures of the tortured nuns approached, their empty eyes and pain-twisted faces eternally etched in my memory. Lorenzo Bellini appeared occasionally, always smiling with icy sadism. "Did you think you could destroy me?" he taunted, his voice echoing in the void. Here, the terror never ends. Every step into the dark hell inside the violin was a torment. The shadows felt alive, dancing and writhing, whispering secrets I never wanted to hear. Spectral figures materialized and disappeared, their faces marked by eternal agony. The walls of the world inside the violin moved, as if they were alive, breathing, squeezing, suffocating. Time passed indistinctly until something changed. A new melody started playing, different from the one I knew. It was as if someone, outside, was trying to play the violin. A feeling of absolute dread came over me. If someone was playing the violin, it meant the cycle of terror was about to begin again. Suddenly, I was pulled back into the real world. I was back in the forbidden room of the convent, but everything was different. The air was heavy, charged with the promise of imminent terror. The shadows on the wall seemed thicker, almost tangible, and the sound of the violin echoed through the room, I realized with horror that I was not alone. Lorenzo Bellini was there, his presence more palpable than ever. "Welcome back," he whispered, his voice thick with mischief. "Now you are one of us." The surrounding shadows stirred, revealing the tortured nuns who now looked even more distorted and horrifying. His eyes, empty and desperate, stared at me with an insatiable hunger for release. I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder and a voice whisper in my ear, "You must continue the ritual." I knew what I needed to do, but terror paralyzed me. With effort, I got up and picked up the violin. The surrounding black candles began to burn with a cold, bluish flame. I began to play the melody, my fingers trembling as the dark notes filled the room. The shadows around me writhed violently, as if they were being exorcised. Suddenly, an invisible force knocked me to the ground. Lorenzo Bellini advanced, his eyes shining with deep hatred. "You will never escape," he shouted, his voice reverberating through the room. "You belong to me." I struggled to get up, feeling a powerful energy pushing me down. The spectral nuns began to scream, their voices joined in a chorus of agony. I felt a searing pain shoot through my body as the shadows enveloped me, trying to pull me back to the violin. With one last desperate effort, I managed to play the last note of the melody. A piercing scream filled the room, and Bellini's figure began to dissipate, his screams of hatred and pain echoing around me. The shadows began to disappear, and the room was filled with an intense, purifying light. When the light finally faded, I was alone in the room, the violin broken into pieces beside me. The convent was silent, an unsettling peace hanging in the air. I knew that evil had been banished, but the cost was too high. My soul was forever scarred by the terror I experienced. As I left the convent, a feeling of relief mixed with a persistent fear accompanied me. He knew that, even with the violin destroyed, the evil that resided there could find a new way to manifest itself. My fight was not over. Only one chapter had closed. And so I left the convent of Santa Clara, aware that the terror never truly ends. He just waits, in the shadows, for a new victim willing to challenge the unknown. And when that day comes, I will be there, ready to face evil once again. But until then, the horror continues to lurk, patiently waiting for its next chance to break free. The convent of Santa Clara, an isolated city shrouded in constant fog, life followed a rhythm of devotion and tranquility. The nuns dedicated their days to prayer, charity, and teaching local children. Among them, Sister Helena was known for her kindness and dedication. Coming from a devout family, Helena always felt a deep connection with her faith, seeking religious life as a refuge for her doubts and concerns. However, when Sister Helena began hearing nightly confessions, the peace of the convent was broken. Over the past week, an unknown female voice, filled with despair and evil, has begun confessing to horrendous crimes and announcing macabre plans for the future. The disturbing account awakened a primordial fear in Helena, making her question her sanity and her faith. My name is Helena, and for years I have found comfort and purpose in religious life. My family has always been deeply Catholic, and since I was little, I was educated to follow the precepts of the faith. After the death of my parents in a tragic accident, I felt a void that was only filled when I entered the convent of Santa Clara. Here I found a new family and a mission to help those in need and strengthen my connection with God. I was recently assigned to hear confessions at night, a task I accepted with humility and a little trepidation. On the first night, everything seemed normal. The older nuns confessed their small faults and daily regrets, but then something changed. It was midnight when I heard the first strange confession. A female voice, low and full of anguish, whispered through the screen. "I killed someone." I stood frozen for a moment, waiting for the woman to continue, but she didn't say anything else. When I asked her name and what had happened, the only response was a long, cold sigh. I tried to calm the woman, offer advice, but she just got up and walked away, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The following nights, the voice returned. The woman confessed to increasingly horrific crimes, describing them in disturbing detail. Every word was like a knife piercing my heart. The feeling of fear and oppression increased with each confession. The shadows in the confession room seemed to lengthen and dance eerily, and the whispers echoed in my mind even after the woman left. The convent at night became a place of shadows and secrets. Candles cast flickering light on the stone walls, and the hallways echoed with ghostly footsteps. The other nuns noticed my uneasiness, but I couldn't tell anyone about the content of the confessions. The secret of confession was sacred, and I needed to honor it, even if it cost me my peace. During the day, I tried to discover who the woman in the confessions could be. I watched the nuns and visitors looking for any sign of guilt or anxiety, but everyone seemed normal, immersed in their daily routines of prayer and work. Each night, the feeling of being watched increased. I started to hear strange noises in my room, footsteps that stopped outside my door, whispers that mixed with the wind. One night, upon returning to my cell after a particularly disturbing confession, I found a note under my door. "You cannot escape evil." My heart skipped a beat. Who knew about the confessions? Was she being threatened? I decided I needed to talk to someone, but who could I trust? The next morning, I went to the office of Mother Superior, a wise and kind woman who had always been a motherly figure to me. I told him about the confessions, omitting the most horrific details, and showed him the note. She listened carefully, her expression serious. "Sister Helena, what you are going through is a test of faith. We must seek strength in our prayers. I'm going to increase security at night and try to find out who could be behind this. But remember, evil always tries to keep us from God. Don't allow him to win." The Mother Superior's words gave me some comfort, but the fear remained. The following nights were even worse. The woman confessed in more detail, describing how she planned to kill again, who would be her next victim. My nights were filled with nightmares, and the lack of sleep began to affect my health. I felt on the verge of a breakdown. On a stormy night, while the rain beat violently on the windows and thunder echoed through the convent, the confession was different. The female voice no longer whispered past crimes, but rather a specific plan to kill one of the nuns, Sister Maria, known for her kindness and dedication to children. Despair took over me. I needed to warn Maria, protect her. I ran through the convent, my heart beating frantically. I found Sister Maria in her cell, reading from a prayer book. "Maria, you need to get out of here. Now." She looked at me, confused and frightened, but before she could answer, I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a hooded figure holding a knife. "You shouldn't have gotten involved, Helena," the female voice said, now clearly threatening. "Now you'll pay for this." The figure advanced and Maria screamed. In an instinctive movement, I pushed the figure away, struggling with all my strength. The knife cut my arm, and the pain was intense, but I kept fighting. Maria ran for help, and I finally managed to wrestle the figure to the ground. By the time the Mother Superior and other nuns arrived, the figure was pinned down. We pulled back the hood, revealing the pale, desperate face of Sister Beatrice, one of the most respected nuns in the convent. Beatrice was taken away by the authorities, and the truth began to emerge. She had been consumed by jealousy and resentment, envying the kindness and devotion of the other nuns. Her crimes were a reflection of her tormented soul, and her confessions were an attempt to find relief from her guilt. The convent was shaken, but we began to rebuild our peace. Even with Beatrice imprisoned, the feeling of oppression did not completely disappear. The nights remained difficult, and the whispers still echoed in my mind. I knew that evil was not just a person, but a force that could return at any moment. We needed to remain vigilant, strengthening our faith and our unity. As night fell again over the convent of Santa Clara, I knew that my battle was far from over. True terror never completely disappears, and darkness always lurks, waiting for a new opportunity to emerge. We were ready to face whatever came, united by the terrifying experience we had shared. We believed that with Sister Beatrice's arrest, the terror had finally come to an end. The disturbing confessions, the threatening notes, everything seemed to have a rational explanation. Yet the feeling of oppression and the whispers persisted, like indelible shadows on the soul. Peace, if we ever knew it, was still far from being achieved. The following nights were marked by an unsettling silence. Sister Maria, whom I had saved from certain death, was eternally grateful but also tormented by fear. The convent, once a haven of serenity, now seemed a place of shadows and dark secrets. One night, the storm that raged outside seemed to want to invade our sanctuary. The rain beat violently against the windows and thunder shook the walls of the monastery. It was then that the voice returned. This time, it was not a distant whisper, but an agonizing scream that echoed through the empty corridors. "Sister Helena, you are not alone." My heart almost stopped. The voice did not come from the confession room, but seemed to resonate within my own mind. Desperate, I grabbed the flashlight and went out into the dark corridors, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As I turned a corner, I caught a glimpse of a figure, a nun, but with a spectral appearance, shrouded in a dark mist. Her eyes, empty and desperate, seemed to devour me. I backed away, but the figure approached slowly, its footsteps silent as death. "Who are you? What do you want of me?" My voice sounded weak, almost swallowed up by the sound of the storm. The figure did not respond. Instead, it raised a pale hand and pointed toward the chapel door. With no choice, I followed the silent command, feeling the weight of an evil presence pushing me forward. The chapel was shrouded in darkness save for the flickering light of the candles on the altar. As I entered, the door slammed shut, trapping me inside. The spectral figure now stood before the altar, its eyes fixed on mine. "Your faith cannot save you," said the voice, now clearly identifiable as Beatrice's but distorted, full of hatred and despair. "You will never understand what I have been through." Before I could respond, I felt an icy hand grip my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw another figure, even more deformed, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. It was Anna, Sophia's dead friend. Her eyes were empty, but filled with pain and accusation. "You must pay," she whispered, her voice echoing through the chapel, "for what you did to me." Terror gripped me. I felt as if I were being pulled into an endless abyss, the voices of the dead nuns echoing in my mind. Screams of agony, whispers of vengeance, all mixed together in a hellish cacophony. I fell to my knees, praying desperately, but the feeling of cold and darkness only grew stronger. Suddenly, the light from the candles on the altar intensified, bathing the chapel in a bright light. Beatrice's figure screamed, a sound of pure agony, before disappearing into the darkness. Anna also began to dissipate, but not before giving one last look of sadness and accusation. When the light finally went out, silence returned. The air was lighter, but I knew peace was still far away. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, and returned to the convent corridors. The shadows still seemed to move at the edges of my vision, and the whispers still echoed in my mind. I found the other nuns gathered in the refectory, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. I told them what had happened, trying to find some comfort in their presence. Mother Superior looked at me with a serious expression. "Sister Helena, the evil we face is not just one person, but a force that inhabits this place. We need to purify the convent, strengthen our faith, and prepare for what is to come." I agreed, but I knew the fight would be long and difficult. True terror never completely disappears, and darkness always lurks, waiting for a new opportunity to emerge. We were ready to face whatever came, united by the terrifying experience we shared. As the storm continued to rage outside, we knew the battle was far from over. The darkness of Santa Clara still had many secrets to reveal, and we were ready to face them. Evil had been confronted, but not defeated, and the sense of oppression that still hung over the convent was a constant reminder that true terror was still lurking, waiting to strike again. The days passed, and the nuns of Santa Clara joined together in a mission of purification and prayer. Every corner of the convent was blessed. Each nun received a protective cross, and prayers became incessant. But even so, the feeling that something dark was still watching us persisted. We knew that although the light shone brighter, the shadow was never far away. We were determined to fight to keep our faith and to protect each other, knowing that the true battle between light and dark was just beginning. As we prepared to face the unknown, the sound of a violin playing a sad and familiar melody echoed through the halls. I looked around, trying to locate the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere, filling the convent with a sense of desolation. We knew that the presence of evil was still among us, and that the fight for our soul and peace was far from over. In the heart of the Atlantic Ocean, there was a small island forgotten by time, known as Ilha do Farol. The island, once inhabited by fishermen, was now deserted except for the solitary lighthouse that stood imposingly above the rocks. Many years ago, a series of tragic and inexplicable events led to the abandonment of the island, and it became the subject of legends and superstitions. Stories of a cursed violin and a vengeful spirit haunted the minds of the few who remembered that place. It was in this scenario that I, João, decided to venture out in search of answers to the disappearance of my grandfather, who had been the last lighthouse keeper on the island. As the boat approached the rocky shore of Lighthouse Island, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The wind howled, bringing with it the salty smell of the sea and the distant echo of seagulls. My determination was stronger than fear. I disembarked with my backpack, containing supplies and an old diary that had belonged to my grandfather. His last notes spoke of a mystery that he was trying to unravel, something that had driven him mad. The island was small, with steep cliffs and low vegetation. The lighthouse, with its imposing structure and weathered walls, stood out against the gray sky. I entered the building, feeling the cold, damp air wrap around me like a blanket. The inside was dark, with only a few beams of light coming in through the dusty windows. The feeling of abandonment was palpable, and the silence was unsettling. My name is João, and since I was little, I have been fascinated by mystery and horror stories. My grandfather always talked about Lighthouse Island, its legends and the secrets it kept. When he disappeared, I decided I needed to find out the truth. His last diary entry spoke of a cursed violin that he believed held the key to understanding the island's dark events. Determined to solve the riddle, I began exploring the lighthouse. As I walked through the dark hallways, my flashlight illuminated scenes from a time gone by. There was old furniture covered in dust, crooked pictures on the walls, and books scattered across the floor. With each step, I felt the invisible presence of something or someone that seemed to be watching me. The lighthouse, with its wooden steps creaking beneath my feet, seemed alive, as if it held dark memories of its history. I climbed to the top of the lighthouse, where a huge Fresnel lens dominated the space. The view was both magnificent and frightening. The rough sea crashed against the rocks below, and the wind blew hard, making the structure shake slightly. I felt a chill imagining my grandfather there, alone, facing the mysteries and terrors that the island hid. In the middle of the room, I found an old wooden chest. I opened it carefully, revealing an antique violin wrapped in a velvet cloth. When I played the instrument, a sensation of intense cold ran through my body. There was something sinister about that violin, and the melody that seemed to emanate from it even without being played was disturbing. I decided to go down and investigate the lower levels of the lighthouse further. As I walked down the stairs, I started hearing unexplainable noises, footsteps that weren't mine, indistinct whispers, and the soft sound of a violin being played in the distance. The feeling of oppression increased with each step, and the air felt heavier, as if something was trying to suffocate me. Upon reaching the basement, the air was even colder and more humid. There was a strong, musty smell, and the darkness was almost total. My flashlight only illuminated a small area around me, creating shadows that danced on the wooden walls. Deep in the basement, I found an old laboratory with glass flasks, rusty equipment, and dusty books. The notes spread across the table indicated that my grandfather was obsessed with understanding the curse of the violin. As I read the texts, I discovered that the violin belonged to a famous violinist named Victor, who had isolated himself on the island after the tragic death of his wife Clara. Victor believed that by playing the right melody, he could bring Clara back. But something went terribly wrong. The notes spoke of macabre rituals and experiments that ended up releasing an evil force, imprisoning Clara's soul, and cursing the violin. Suddenly, I heard a sound behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. The feeling of being watched increased, and the whispers around me intensified. Fear began to take over me, but I knew I needed to keep going. I decided to take the violin outside the lighthouse and see if I could find out anything else. As I walked around the island, night began to fall, and darkness enveloped everything around me. The wind howled, and the feeling of cold increased. I felt a dark presence following me, and the sound of the violin continued to echo in my mind. I arrived at a clearing where I found an old cemetery, with tombstones worn out by time and graves covered in vegetation. In the center of the cemetery, there was a larger and more elaborate tomb, with Clara's name engraved on the tombstone. I approached the tomb, feeling an intense cold and a feeling of oppression that almost paralyzed me. Suddenly, the violin in my hands began to play by itself, a sad, somber melody that seemed to echo throughout the entire island. Clara's spectral figure appeared before me, with an expression of sadness and despair. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the darkness. Victor tried to get me back but failed. Now I'm trapped, and the island is cursed. My heart was beating fast, and the feeling of fear was almost unbearable. "What can I do to help you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Destroy the violin," she replied. "It's the source of the curse. Only then can my soul rest." With all my strength, I smashed the violin against Clara's tombstone. The sound of cracking wood echoed across the clearing, and the spectral figure let out a high-pitched scream before disappearing. The melody stopped, and the air in the clearing grew warm again. I felt a sense of relief, but also sadness. He knew he had freed Clara's soul, but the island still held many secrets and dangers. As I left the cemetery, the sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the island. The feeling of being watched hadn't completely disappeared, and I knew my journey was far from over. Lighthouse Island had been just the beginning. As I walked back to the lighthouse, night was falling quickly, enveloped by a blanket of darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. The sense of relief I felt after destroying the violin was quickly replaced by a new uneasiness. The forest surrounding the island was shrouded in dense fog, and every shadow seemed to hide a dark secret. My legs were tired, but I kept walking, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a crack to my left. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything. Silence returned, but my heart was still beating fast. I quickened my pace, trying to leave the damned place behind. As I walked through the forest, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. The feeling of being watched increased, and I began to hear soft, almost inaudible whispers around me. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding me like an invisible circle. I stopped again, trying to locate the source of the whispers, but the fog and darkness made it difficult to see. Finally, I saw the lights of the lighthouse in the distance. The relief I felt upon seeing them was indescribable. I quickened my pace, determined to leave that damned place behind. When I reached the edge of the forest, I looked back one last time. The shadows seemed to move strangely as if they were alive. I shook my head, trying to shake off the thoughts of terror, and continued walking until I reached the lighthouse. Upon entering the lighthouse, I locked the door and threw myself on the sofa, exhausted. My body hurt and my mind was racing. I took my grandfather's diary and started writing down everything that had happened. The experience on Lighthouse Island had been terrifying, but I knew I couldn't stop. I needed to find out more about the curse and what had happened to Victor and Clara. The following days were full of research and trying to understand events on the island. I discovered that Victor had been a man obsessed with getting his wife back, using increasingly dark methods. His search for the perfect essence led to a series of macabre experiments, and the island was abandoned after a series of unexplained disappearances. While researching, I started to notice strange things happening at the lighthouse. Objects moved around on their own. I heard inexplicable noises at night, and the feeling of being watched never left me. One night, I woke up to the feeling of intense cold and realized that my room was full of dancing shadows. I got up and went to the living room. When I got there, I saw something that made me freeze in fear. In the center of the room, there was a violin, identical to the one I had destroyed in the clearing. His empty eyes seemed to watch me, and a sinister smile was carved on his face. I picked up the violin with shaking hands and realized there was something written on its base. The words, "The curse never ends," were engraved there. My heart was beating fast and the feeling of terror was overwhelming. I knew I needed to return to the clearing to discover the truth behind the curse and possibly find a way to end it once and for all. I returned to the clearing the next morning, determined to find answers. Upon entering, the feeling of oppression returned with full force. I began exploring again, this time looking for clues that could help me understand the curse. I found more notes from Victor, detailing his experiments and his search for the perfect essence. I discovered that there was a secret basement in the lighthouse where the darkest experiments were carried out. I found the entrance hidden behind a bookshelf in Victor's office. The air in the basement was heavy and smelled of decay. The walls were covered in strange symbols and scratch marks, and the floor was littered with unfinished violins and experiment materials. In the center of the basement, there was a large wooden table with an old book and a violin. The book was full of rituals and incantations, and the violin seemed to emanate a dark energy. I realized I needed to destroy both of them to end the curse once and for all. I picked up the book and the violin, feeling the weight of responsibility in my hands. As I prepared to destroy them, I heard slow, shuffling footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the spectral figure of Clara, with an expression of sadness and despair. "Please help me," she whispered. "I'm stuck here because of my husband's obsession. You must end this." With renewed determination, I broke the violin and tore up the book, throwing the pieces on the floor. The spectral figure let out a high-pitched scream before disappearing, and a wave of energy coursed through the basement, dispelling the shadows and the feeling of oppression. I left the clearing feeling a mix of relief and sadness. He knew he had freed Clara's soul, but the island still held many secrets and dangers. My journey was far from over, and the fight against the forces of darkness would be endless. As I walked back to the lighthouse, the feeling that something more terrible was yet to come never quite left me. The dark forest held many secrets, and I was determined to uncover them, knowing that each discovery would bring new challenges and horrors to face. The sense of relief I felt upon leaving the clearing was quickly replaced by a new uneasiness. The forest air around me seemed to carry an invisible weight, as if the island's dark secrets had decided to follow me. The shadows lengthened ominously, and the fog seemed to form figures that watched me with sinister intentions. Upon arriving home, locking the door behind me, the feeling of security was momentary. I spent the next few days trying to distract myself with everyday activities, but my mind was constantly caught up in images of the clearing and Victor's disturbing notes. The nights were especially difficult. Vivid nightmares tormented me, always involving the spectral figure of Clara and the haunting melody of the violin. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I was awakened by a low, rhythmic sound. It sounded like a constant drumming, almost as if someone was playing a melody on a violin. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I slowly stood up, following the sound to the living room. To my horror, I saw a violin, identical to the one I destroyed in the clearing, resting on the table. Terror took over me, but also the determination to end that curse once and for all. I picked up the violin with shaking hands, and without thinking twice, threw it into the fireplace, watching the flames consume the instrument. For a brief moment, the sound ceased and the feeling of oppression eased. However, the relief was short-lived. The next morning, I found a new diary among Victor's old papers. It was different from the others, with notes that detailed protective rituals and the full story of the curse that haunted the island. I discovered that the music played on the violin was a special piece composed by Victor in a moment of despair. He believed that by playing the melody, he could open a portal to the afterlife and bring Clara back. However, in doing so, he inadvertently trapped his soul and those of many others in limbo, condemning them to eternally wander between the worlds. I realized that the only way to end the curse once and for all was to perform the closing ritual described in Victor's diary. I needed to return to the clearing and perform the ritual in the place where it all began. I invited Lucas to accompany me, and he, although reluctant, accepted. Armed with the diary, flashlights, and our determinations, we returned to the clearing. When we arrived, the atmosphere was even heavier and darker than before. The clearing seemed like a macabre sentinel, awaiting our arrival. We entered and made our way to the center, where I found Clara's gravestone. The air was chilly, and the whispers began again, echoing through the clearing. The shadows danced as if they had a life of their own, and the melody of the violin echoed in the distance, increasing the tension. Following the instructions in the journal, I drew the symbols on the ground and recited the ancient words. As the ritual progressed, the temperature dropped dramatically and a dense shadow began to form in the center of the circle. Clara's spectral figure appeared again, this time accompanied by several other trapped souls, all with expressions of pain and despair. "You must finish what you started," she whispered, her voice filled with urgency. With extreme effort, I continued the ritual. Lucas held the lantern, trying to remain calm as the shadows around us grew more aggressive. The light from the lantern flickered frantically, and the feeling of oppression was overwhelming. Finally, with the last word of the ritual, a bright light filled the clearing, and the spectral figures let out agonized screams before disappearing. The silence that followed was deafening. The feeling of oppression disappeared and the air became lighter. We knew that we had succeeded in freeing the trapped souls. The violin melody ceased, and the clearing fell into a deep, almost comforting silence. But even as we celebrated our victory, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that true terror never completely disappears. As we left the clearing for the last time, I looked back at the island one last time. I knew that many secrets still lay buried in this place, waiting to be discovered. The struggle between light and darkness is eternal, and though we had won that battle, the war against the unknown continued. I was ready to face whatever challenges the future brought, knowing that true courage comes from facing the unknown head-on. As we walked back to the lighthouse, the feeling of relief quickly turned to a new form of dread. Every shadow in the forest seemed to lengthen and twist, forming indistinct figures that seemed to follow us with invisible eyes. Lucas and I walked in silence, our thoughts heavy with the memories of the trapped souls and the intense struggle we had endured. But the worst was yet to come. When we reached the lighthouse, we noticed that the door, which I had locked, was ajar. A chill ran down my spine as Lucas and I exchanged apprehensive glances. We entered slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand, and closed the door behind us. The lighthouse was plunged into oppressive darkness, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "Do you feel that?" I whispered to Lucas, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yes, something is not right," he replied, fear evident in his tone. As we climbed the stairs, the sound of our footsteps echoed eerily off the stone walls. Each step seemed to take us deeper into an abyss of terror. When we reached the top, we found the violin we had destroyed, remarkably intact and lying on the table. The words, "The curse never ends," were carved into its wooden body with a ghostly glow. Before we could react, the spectral figure of Clara appeared before us, her empty eyes an expression of despair more intense than ever. She opened her mouth, but her voice was an echo of agony that seemed to come from every corner of the lighthouse. "You are not finished," she said, her voice reverberating off the walls. "The true horror is only just beginning." Suddenly, the violin began to play on its own, a hellish melody that seemed to distort the very fabric of reality. The shadows on the walls came to life, twisting and turning into grotesque figures that slowly advanced towards us. The air around us turned icy, and the feeling of oppression was so intense that we could barely breathe. Lucas grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out of here now." But before we could move, an unseen force pushed us against the wall, pinning us with a crushing pressure. Shadowy figures surrounded us, their forms indistinct and their faces contorted in expressions of pain and hatred. The violin's melody grew in intensity, each note a stab of pure terror. Clara stepped closer, her spectral figure almost solid in the darkness. "You freed the souls, but you awakened something far worse. The violin's curse is only the tip of the iceberg." With a supreme effort, I managed to move and grab Victor's diary, desperately searching for something that could save us. The notes spoke of a last resort, a sealing ritual that could trap the entities forever but was extremely dangerous. With no other choice, I began to recite the ancient words, my hands shaking and my voice cracking with fear. The shadows around us began to shake violently, their voices forming a chorus of agony. Clara tried to move forward, but the light emanating from the ritual stopped her. Lucas, mustering all his strength, held the lantern tightly, keeping the light on the shadowy, writhing figures. "You will never escape," cried Clara, her voice an echo of despair and anger. With the last word of the ritual, an explosion of light filled the lighthouse. The shadows let out deafening screams before being sucked into the violin, which shattered into 1,000 pieces. Clara let out one last sigh of relief before disappearing completely. The silence that followed was absolute. The feeling of oppression finally disappeared, and the air became lighter. Lucas and I were exhausted but alive. We knew that, at least for now, the battle was won. Upon leaving the lighthouse, the island looked different. The shadows no longer moved with their own life, and the wind blew gently, bringing a feeling of peace. But as we looked at the remains of the destroyed violin, a sense of unease remained. "Is it over?" Lucas asked, his voice full of uncertainty. "I hope so," I replied. But deep down I knew that true terror never completely disappears. It just hides, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. As we returned to the boat, ready to leave Lighthouse Island behind, one last shadow moved discreetly in the depths of the forest. The fight between light and darkness is eternal, and although we have won that battle, the war against the unknown continues. We were ready to face whatever challenge the future brought, knowing that true courage comes from facing the unknown head-on, without ever letting our guard down. And so we left Lighthouse Island, aware that somewhere in the depths of the ocean, the shadows were still patiently waiting for their moment of revenge.